Hello everyone, welcome along to Digishift 95. We're creeping ever closer to number 100. Today we're unpacking findings from the Charity Digital Skills Report 2026, produced by Zoe Amar and Nissa Ramsay. The report, for those of you who don't know, is based on responses from over 800 organisations. There's lots of encouraging progress. 80% of charities now using AI, but also gaps in the sector, like those kind of critical skills, leadership and governance gaps that we've seen in past reports. But Zoe's probably going to reflect on some of that stuff today. So we're joined by Zoe Amar today. If for those of you who don't know Zoe, I'm sure most of you do, one of the sector's leading digital experts, founder of Zoe Amar Digital, and also the chair of the Charity Digital Code of Practice. So I'll hand over to Zoe, and usual DigiShift will have time for Q&A, debate, discussion, and everything in between.
Good morning, everyone. Hello, it is lovely to be here. So my job for the next 5 minutes is just to do a bit of a scene set. I'm going to take you through four key headlines from the reports. I've been asked to do this in 5 minutes, which is tight, but hopefully we'll sort of set the scene. And then obviously we're going to go into a lot more discussion around some of the data from the report itself. So there's four key headlines that I want to share with you, which hopefully will get us all thinking about where the charity sector is going with digital and AI, and what some of those barriers are to moving forward. So I've just got a few slides to share with you. So I'm just going to grab those and then I'll take you through them. And I'll pop the link to these slides in the chat later because I'm very happy for you to have them. So what I wanted to start by talking about then is looking at the digital stage of charities. So what we found this year, we had quite a dramatic increase in our response rate, and we had over 100 charities respond from Scotland, which is an increase, which I was really, really pleased to see. So pleased to get involved in the 2027 report as well. But our big learning from that response rate growing further and perhaps being a bit more representative of what the sector looks like overall is that largely speaking, charities are at an early stage with digital. And I think what this really speaks to is the fact that the sector is changing rapidly because of digital and AI disruption. And that for me is a very clear-cut case for support from funders, from support organisations, from infrastructure bodies, from regulators as well. So I'm sure that's something that will come out more in the discussion as we go through today, what that looks like. You'll also see that that case for support has some very clear facets, which I'll talk about earlier, because everyone who got involved in the report this year was really clear on the support they need. Just to briefly say a bit more about that stage with digital, whilst charities are mostly at that early stage, so 72%, what we saw is that there's some nuances within the data. It's interesting that more large charities than we thought there would be are at that early stage, and also an increase in small charities who are at an early stage. And we've had some interesting debates behind the scenes in the report team on whether this really reflects the fact that the sector is still stuck at this quite early stage with digital, or are charities just becoming more aware of the fact that they are at this early starting point and they need to move forward. So I think that's definitely something that's worth discussing as well. Then, if we move on to the big thing that everyone's talking about at the moment, and probably will be now until the end of time, it is AI adoption. So, just to sort of refresh some of our data there, some of you will have seen that this was 88% in the interim findings. Actually, in the final report itself, it was 79%, but that's still an increase from last year when 76% of charities are using AI. What I think this also tells us, even though that's a relatively small increase, is that the use of AI across the sector is absolutely becoming more embedded and it's becoming more strategic. So the big takeaway for me here is that 38% of charities are now using AI actively and strategically, up from 25% last year. And as you might expect, large charities are a bit further ahead than small organisations. And this is where I think there's also a really important case for supporting charities who are under that 1 million turnover bracket. So, just to briefly talk about how charities are using AI in their work, and we've got lots more data in the report itself, which we will explore this morning about all other aspects of digital and AI. But I thought someone's probably thinking about how are charities using AI, and it's really interesting because there are some changes from last year, but also some things which are really just about some use cases that were quite established becoming even more so this year, such as admin and project management. But I think it's interesting that that is almost like business as usual across the sector. What I'd also pick out from this slide, which I think is a new development, is that monitoring and evaluation has gone up quite significantly as well. Now, this is something we're getting asked about all the time by charities. How can I use AI to analyze my data, understand the impact that we're having, create a narrative out of all the qual and quant data that we have? And I think there's massive potential here for the sector to use AI for this, as well as the other things that we have amongst these use cases as well. And then I thought I'd just finish this little scene setting exercise by talking about some of the priorities that you've told us are really important to you in the year ahead. Now, I particularly want to highlight skills here because this came out really loud and clear every time we asked about what support charities needed to move forward with digital and AI, and where charities needed funding, where they needed guidance and help. And skills came up repeatedly throughout the whole report. So as you can see here, that is a real priority, and it's a priority for people at all different levels of the organisation, from staff to volunteers to leaders, even more of a priority for large charities. But we know from the wider data, also really important to small organisations as well. In terms of some of the other areas where charities want to develop, online presence and comms, also really important. I wonder whether there's that growing need to fundraise behind that. And that's also something we see quite a lot in the reports. And it's interesting because data is very much a growing priority here. And I do wonder whether that is being driven by the need for us all to get our data in order so that we can make the most of AI's potential. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavour of where charities are at in terms of stage of digital progress, how AI adoption is growing, and also some of the priorities for the year ahead. So as you can see here, this is a big story of change. And if I had to summarise this year's report in a nutshell, I'd say the data, the insight really shows us that the sector is changing. It also shows us that charities are not being offered the things they really need in order to sustain that change. And that is funding, that is more support from support organisations, and obviously having some investment and resource in building skills across the sector in every level of our organisations. And that is what I'd really like to see change across the sector. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Zoe. That was great. Just say for everyone in the room, if you want to pop questions in the chat, we'll pick up questions as we go. I thought I'd have one to kick us off, and then Maddie, you probably got a question as well for Zoe. I think one of the things that really struck me was 79% of charities using the AI routinely, but we've then got three quarters still self-identify as being at an early digital stage, and there's this kind of tension, this gap between how tech's actually being used and how it's integrated strategically. And I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that or what needs to change, or yeah, I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. I think that's such a great question because it really epitomizes, as it summarizes the tension which I see at the heart of the data in the report this year. So you've got all this change happening, you've got wider AI adoption, the way in which it's getting more embedded, and there's digital progress happening. So 81% of charities have progressed with digital this year. And yet, that change is built on quite wobbly foundations, is how I would look at it, because there isn't the digital funding there. The skills need to be developed across the sector. And I think that really comes down to funding and guidance and commitment from leaders and strategy, and of course, boards as well. So it's change. But big question mark, is it sustainable change? And what we need is an ecosystem of support around charities to really ensure they're future ready.
Yeah, yeah, thanks, Zoe. That was really useful. Maddie, anything you want to jump in with before we open up questions?
Think my biggest thing is around funders, Zoe, because it is that it's something for me that you've always said, we've all been doing this for quite some time, about trying to get funders to fund the right thing. And it seems that now there was a flurry of funding, digital funding, transformation funding, that, although it was quite small. But again, the funders, from my view, from what I see, seem to be playing catch up. So how do we, like, what is it that we think that they misunderstand about the situation? What is it they're missing, that they're not understanding, that needs to be part of our funding bids? In your view, Zoe, obviously, what do you think?
Thank you, Maddie. Yes, I think that's a really important point you've raised there. I wonder whether there's something about funders' own digital and AI skills,
Yeah.
um, in terms of understanding that bigger picture of the massive societal impact, in particular AI-driven change, is going to have. I mean, I think we've not even really seen the start of it yet, the full extent of what's really going to happen. So this is something we always try and say to funders when we talk to them about the report findings. And this is something we're going to keep banging the drum for and trying to influence other organisations such as infrastructure bodies to really try and land that message with them. So in summary, I wonder whether it's something to do with a skills gap, but also I think there is a bit of a vacuum around this consensus across the sector about how far reaching this change really is going to be. Because I think, if
Mm-hmm.
anything, we've underestimated it.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you're talking about, we're always talking about we need to upskill our staff, our charities, and where we're at with digital skills. But where are the people who are saying the funders also need to be skilled in understanding what this is and what the possibility is? That seems to, it's all about us, which actually it should be a bit about them, I think, really kind of pushing that up and saying, you need to fully understand this before you can then start talking about it, I think, is part of my reasoning behind it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we all need to collectively go on this journey together as a sector. Otherwise, we won't actually be able to get to where we need to get to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Zoe. Back to you, Rose.
Yeah, we don't have any hands up or questions, but I'm going to give people a chance to do that just now before I move on to other questions that I've got, because I've got loads. But it can't just be me waffling on the whole time. There we go. There's one from
There
Kelly
we go.
in the chat. So Kelly's asked, Kelly, are you okay on muting and just asking it yourself, or do you want me to ask it for you?
Yeah, sure, that's not a problem.
Okay.
I'll come up on video as well. Just please excuse the messy room behind me. Yeah, like I was really struck by that number of people who feel like they need skills training in this area. And what I kind of keep coming up against is the fact that most people in digital learnt the skills vocationally. They learnt it through experimentation and trying. But people feel anxious about not having formal learning settings when it comes to this kind of thing. And I'm sort of wondering if there's a disconnect there in terms of people say, I feel like I need formal training in this, but the formal training doesn't really match the way that everyone else who learned this has learned previously about digital skills. And that maybe might answer like Maddie's last point there about what funders are looking for, of like it's really hard to come up with training programs for things like this if you're trying to force vocational learning into a formal learning construct.
Thank you, Kelly. I think that's a brilliant question, and that really chimes with what I see as being most effective in learning about digital and AI. Because, like you, I've learned so much of the stuff that I now have on the job. That's how we all learn in digital, by doing and learning and by reinforcing. So when we ask people about skills in the survey itself, we didn't just frame it as training. I mean, I think it's a thing people will always ask for when they want to close a skills gap. But later on in the survey, we also asked people about how they like to learn about digital, and we also asked them about AI. And there are a number of different ways, obviously, everything from peer learning, mentoring, self serve learning as well, podcasts. So we do have a question which I'll try and dig out towards the end of the survey, where we ask people about those digital learning methods. And it's interesting because over the years, training has actually dropped slightly, and some of these more informal ways of learning have improved. So I think you're absolutely bang on. We need to have that really holistic understanding of what learning looks like across the sector. We definitely need funders to understand that as well, because otherwise I don't see how funder plus programs can be truly effective. And I think we need leaders and boards to really understand those multifaceted ways in which people learn, because everyone has a different learning preference, right? For some people, going on a training course is great. Other people would prefer to turn to the person on the desk next to them and say, well, how do I do this? So I think it's about making learning something we're all doing every day, that we're really committing to learning, that's being resourced properly. And that for me says something about how organisational cultures and ways of managing need to evolve as much as there being some resource for upskilling. Thank you, Kelly. Love that question. Thank you.
That was a great question. Yeah, I think there's still a lot of organizations stuck in this 2 decades out of date model of what IT and digital training looks like. I start a job, someone teaches me all the tools, those tools don't change for 5, 7, maybe 10 years, and then I get some training on a new system, and it's quite a passive relationship. And I guess AI has really opened up room for experimentation, sometimes safely, sometimes not. But that relationship with digital has changed so much over the last decade, and in the last even 6 months has evolved so much. So I think, yeah, for me, there's like a culture piece within there as well about the relationship staff have with IT.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, Ross. And I think that if we can learn anything from, I mean, you like me, and also John and Maddie, we've been part of that first wave of digital skills being injected into the sector pre-lockdown. Remember when I think Lloyd's Bank had a program, and so did Barclays. Maddie's nodding as well. And one of the things that perhaps didn't quite work through no fault of any of the organisations who were providing the training is I'm really, really passionate about training and learning and upskilling not being a transactional product. I do not believe it's something you can just drop into an organisation. It's a commoditized thing. I don't think any sector quite yet fully mature enough to just, go to the thing and imbibe the thing. I think this is very much, as you say, Ross, about giving people the resources and the tools and the different ways of learning so they can change alongside how this is changing their organizations. So we need ways of learning which are much more embedded, continuous, lifelong, but are inclusive as well, so that everyone has an opportunity to grow these skills.
Yep, totally. Thanks, Zoe. John's got his hand up.
I got a question, maybe it pulls a bit of that together, which is thinking particularly about AI, because I totally get that point about the way organizations are exploring it. Looks like a kind of continuous, trying and iterating rather than doing a one-off, like Ross talked about. But I suppose the question I'm wondering about is kind of shallow versus deep AI, by which I mean, if you look in the data you have there about the use cases, quite often they're the kind of fairly obvious, easy to do use cases where you're kind of making a bit of a saving on a kind of very standard task. But obviously, long term, the opportunity is probably around doing really new and different things. And I suppose I'm thinking about in a voluntary sector context, it's really hard to carve out the time to do that. Right, we're going to really think about things quite differently and try a really new approach because really what you're often under pressure to do is do the same kind of stuff a bit more quickly. So I wondered if you had any data points about our organizations able to commit a bit of resource to really in-depth training, or is it a bit more of a general category? And maybe a question for the room actually about if people have had experience, has it been the kind of doing small bits of training and small learning, or has it been more about investing a bit more time and resource? So yeah, for Zoe, it's really a question about is there any kind of data sitting in with this training?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we haven't asked people about the depth of the interventions around training. We do have a question about digital learning within the report, so I'll dig that out in a moment. What we find with the charities that we support day to day is that pretty much what I said earlier, that you need to make sure that you understand where people are, so what your baseline of digital and AI skills is, and then design your learning offer. So it's got all of these different methods that people can engage with to learn. But that's also very importantly being reinforced by the way people are managed, how performance is assessed, what the culture is like as well. And I think you're right. It's so hard to make that case for investment, isn't it? To justify justify learning when everyone's worried about service demand and funding. So I think that really speaks to maybe a different kind of leadership that we need to see across the sector, not lessening the urgency on those essential things for organisational survival, but saying it's not an either or. We can do this and we can keep the lights on. We also need to be learning at the same time because that's how we ensure our long-term future.
Thank you.
Thanks, Zoe. That was great. I'm going to pick up a couple of things in the chat, and then I know that Maddie's got a question as well, and then we'll come back to Anne's point. Just one from Tarek that was an observation rather than a question in the chat, but whether we as a sector embrace AI fully internally or not will affect us from internal and external forces like AI search, shadow AI use, massively shaping what society and the economy looks like as well. And I can't think of anything in my time working in the charity sector that's had such an external impact in that way. So, yeah. Okay, James has got a question around influence and leadership in digital. So he's gone through agile project management, really helping our ways of working through collaboration and goal setting. Currently experiment with his own work. Currently not sure how to get it on the radar if it lacks internal political salience. So yeah, how do we get leadership on board with digital data and design? And I think thinking about leadership in terms of the CEO and leadership team as well as the governance layer in the organization.
Mm. Yeah, and thank you very much, James. I think that's a really brilliant question you've asked there. In my experience, what I would try and do is break this down into some of the key elements that leaders need to understand. And for me, the most fundamental thing about being really user-centered is how much the users actually get talked about in the boardroom or around the senior leadership team table. So that's something we often ask when we start working with organisations. How often is your leadership team looking at user insight? What role does that play in the decisions that they make? So sometimes what you need to do with that, in my experience, and this is just something that I would do, may not work for everyone, is I'm inclined to go a bit shock and awe. So I've worked with organisations before where we will always look at what users are saying, we'll do some user research. And then in particular, if you can play that back to the leadership team and perhaps challenge some of their assumptions about what they think their audience is saying about their charity, then that can be a really good way for them suddenly to put those light bulbs on and say, oh, actually, we really need to take this seriously. We really need to look at this data and insight more regularly. So I think you might need some kind of intervention because if you show them a sort of framework around being agile, they might not fully engage with it. But if you can get them to engage with one thing and make it emotive, that could be a really good way in.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Zoe. Maddie, I know you wanted to ask a question a wee bit about transformation, and then we'll maybe come back to Anne's point, which I think is, yeah, really interesting.
I guess it probably, some of the things might encompass some of the other questions I've been asking, but for me, I think because of the work that I do within digital evolution or digital transformation, just thinking from all of the stuff you've seen, all of the years you've been doing this, Zoe, what distinguishes the successful embedding of digital to the unsuccessful? Is it to do with size? Is it all about people? Is it how much money we throw at this? How can we? There are organisations that do and are still continuing to struggle with embedding digital into the way that they work, and even just that thing from Anne around people who will not use AI versus people who are using it. How we're what can we do, I suppose? What's the distinguishing factor, I guess?
So there's three things that I think are really important here. Obviously, resourcing and funding really does help. But I'd say there are two other things which are in many ways almost as important as frankly having the cash. I think some of this is very much down to leadership. Every organization we've worked with where leadership are on board, they're open, they're committed to doing things differently, they're willing to ask challenging questions of themselves and others. That for me is a real green flag that says to me this is ultimately going to really go somewhere. And then the second thing, and this sounds really boring, is about consistency. It's about grit. There's so many leaders I've had the privilege of working with across the sector who've pushed through some very difficult digital and AI change. And so often this stuff is down to just this kind of war of attrition. There's this constant, this is happening, this is happening. Okay, fine, we need to fine tune this bit, but it is still happening. And it's the people who are willing to work really tirelessly to push stuff through and to be consistent with it. That for me is one of the core ingredients of really strong digital leadership.
I
Yeah,
would agree. I think that's brave. Brave would be my word. Be brave. Get
yeah.
out there and
I
be
think that
brave.
it leads on really nicely to Anne's
Mhm.
point, and I feel quite strongly about this one. So yeah, talking about almost the kind of shame that she actually used the term "dirty secret" of using AI. And I've had quite a few conversations this recently where there's a lot of people kind of gatekeeping AI. So particularly, I think like I see this a lot in the design field where there's a kind of preciousness about, oh, you mustn't use AI. You need to hire a very expensive designer. When we know the reality is, if you're a very small charity or community group, that's not going to be reasonable. And actually, lots of people blocking the use of AI simply because people are ashamed to admit they're using it. And I don't know, yeah, I'd be interested to know your thoughts on this one, Zoe.
Yeah, I think culturally this is so interesting, right? Because none of us would feel ashamed about looking something up on a database or using Google. If a colleague told me they were doing that to do, I go, oh, brilliant, they're just doing it properly. And yet, this use of these tools to help us do things, I mean, what is shameful about it isn't is not a sin to use AI. But yeah, I don't quite know why that is, although obviously I do see that every day. Again, this is where leadership can make a really big difference. We've just finished working with a small charity on an AI roadmap, where what really helped was their leadership team were really open about their use of AI. So someone asked a great question earlier about how do you engage leaders. I think the number one thing you can do, as with any form of digital transformation, get your CEO to talk about what they're doing. They don't need to say, I've cracked how to do it. It's really about, I'm using it and it's okay, and I'm giving other people permission to do it with these guardrails. I guess one thing that might be behind that question, which I think is such a great issue that you've raised, Anne, is really about those broader questions on ethical issues. And I think organisations need to make the space and the time to have those discussions, whether it's about the environmental side of things, whether it's about the supply chain, whether it's about bias. Because until you have those and you try and broker some agreement on those really challenging ethical issues, then it's quite hard to move forward and to have that freer attitude to saying, yeah, I used AI to do this, and what's wrong with that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I think within that, you can have conversations that are not being dismissive of people's distrust of AI. So, we've got massive corporate conglomerates telling us what the world needs to look like as if we have no voice in it. So there's obvious concerns around that. There's the climate concerns, there's ethical concerns. What I would love organizations to be thinking about is applying that same lens to everything that they do, like the bank that they choose, the other tech products that they choose, the social media platforms that they choose to put content on every single day. And actually, we need to apply those ethical and environmental lenses to everything that we're doing and all the decisions that we're making. Does that seem fair?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, so if, for example, if you're going to use AI less on the grounds of some of those ethical and sustainability reasons you rightly reference there, then we should be consistent about that across everything.
Yeah, yeah. There's a really good piece on the SCVO digital site around climate concerns and some of the environmental questions. I don't know, if John or Maddie, if there's anything you want to come in on those, 'cause I know you both kind of got some thoughts on it and written some stuff up.
I'm gonna bring John in on this. I think would be the best idea.
I think we haven't done anything recently. You might have seen something I posted on LinkedIn last week. We had last year, people were asking environmental questions, so that's covered as part of our AI guide. One of the big challenges is there's not very much data, so the AI companies are not transparent at all about the energy impacts, and that leads to a lot of speculation. Um, I do, I would take the point that it's like a lot of other big tech, there's big numbers involved. your own use of it is probably not going to be a big deal, but then you do have a lot of data center build out, and that's a big issue in Scotland right now. It's become quite political as well. So I think there's those kind of choices there that we always have. I can certainly drop a link to the LinkedIn thing in chat, but yeah, I mean, I think our take would be probably don't sit there and say, yes, of course, I'm happy to share the guide. I'll do that in a wee second. Um, don't sit there and say we're not going to use AI, because your personal environmental impact would be quite small, but it is worth thinking about the fact that big tech companies were all on track for net zero by 2030, and now they're not. And that's not because of more social media, it's because of the AI, the way that industry is going right now. So it's, there's big questions for sure. Um, I
I'm
don't
going
know,
to move
some
things on a wee bit because I'm conscious we're kind of
sure, sure.
focusing on AI
Yeah,
quite a lot. One of the things I'm interested in, there's obviously, we know there's been a big data breach with one of the major CRMs that's used in the charity sector at the moment. I'd be interested to know what the report is telling us about ethics, safety concerns, cyber, and yeah, just any findings from the report on that, Zoe, that you think would be relevant to the group.
Thanks, Ross. Yeah, I'd need to dig out the data on cyber, so I will have a look at that. I mean, as I recall off the top of my head, I think there was definitely a lot of charities who want to improve those skills. I mean, that for me is one of those systemic issues that we do see year on year in the report. Given what's happened in recent weeks with Beacon and also with CAF. I think we might revisit some of the data that we gather every year about data and cyber and ask an additional set of questions because it feels like that's such a key issue for the sector, being able to trust the tools it uses, whether it's digital AI, quite rightly. So if anyone's got any particular aspects around those issues that you would like us to gather data on in next year's report, we're already starting to think about 2027. So please do drop me a line if there's any numbers that you think would be particularly useful for us to gather.
Brilliant. Yeah. Also, just to say as well, Alison Brogan at SCVO, who leads on cyber work, has done a briefing, I believe, around, we can probably put a link in the chat, around the Beacon breach. And there's a lot of work going on in the background in Scotland around that and kind of guiding charities around that as well. But it's increasingly feeling like more and more, whatever tools we're choosing, there's going to be a breach in the future rather than like, will there be a breach? And it's how we're prepared for that and what that looks like. And I think particularly those smaller charities that don't have internal teams and leadership that really understands it and everything is outsourced, that's when it becomes quite difficult. And again, just going back to the report, it's like that need for leadership to really get to grips with some of this stuff.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think so. Sorry, just to say, I've just grabbed some data here, so I'll
mm,
just read out some of this for you. So actually, what we heard about data protection and cyber security in the report this year, it did look like progress. So 29% saw themselves as excellent at data protection and GDPR compliance, 48% see themselves as good. More than half are excellent or good at cybersecurity. However, this falls to only 43% of small charities who would benefit from increasing their skills in this area. 79% of large charities rate themselves as excellent or good. So I think that's quite interesting because would people give themselves the same rating now? Obviously, this wasn't the fault of the charities who were involved in some of the things we have seen recently at all. But I think it's also one of those areas where you should probably always be a bit worried about it, because the goalposts are moving all the time, aren't they? So we'll see whether there's some data that we can gather around that in the report next year that would help.
Brilliant. Thanks, Zoe. John's got his hand up and then we'll come back to Becky in the chat.
And yeah, just quickly on cyber, I think the kind of theme that's coming out there is a bit around what questions might you want to ask up front. And obviously, once something's happened, it's very easy to go, oh, well, that's kind of quite obscure technical question you might not have thought of would have been really important to ask. So that I think is one of the challenges where you'll often have vendors where a lot of the obvious things you'd look for are in place and it looks like a solid picture. So I think one of the challenges charities will probably have is, you know, if you've got concerns, how do you get the right questions on the table at the start And that's a bit of a challenge, I think, with digital and tech, because I think part of what you're doing with a vendor is saying, well, there is somebody with the technical expertise. So I think there's a big piece there. And I've seen those stats as well, Zoe, around if you ask about data protection, people generally feel they're doing the right things and they probably are internally, but it's like, are they making sure that makes its way to third-party providers as well? And that's more complicated, I think.
Yeah, it is complicated. And it's really hard when you've got limited people, limited resources. But I'm hopeful that some really good learnings can come out of these incidents for all of us. And I think it also shows that when it comes to agentic AI, we want to get these building blocks in place first. We want to be really confident about cyber and data protection before we move on to doing the more risky, complex stuff.
Thanks, Zoe. Becky, are you comfortable unmuting and asking your question around leadership?
Yeah, I can do. Sorry not to be on camera. I'm in the office, which is quite busy. Yeah, I just had a question or kind of reflection around how organizations can deal with leadership being, I would say, theoretically on board with digital change. There's a lot of, yes, we think this is important. Yes, we want to see digital change. Yes, we should be more mature, but actually quite a lack of uh, technical ability or skills or knowledge to give that any sort of direction. And then, as ever with charities, a fairly small kind of resource behind who does that work? What does that mean? Where do we go? So just a question around, yeah, how we could address that. What's something we might take forward? Is that where a strategy comes in, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you, Becky. I think that's a great question. So I think in a nutshell, yes, that is where a strategy comes in, but only if it's really got the backing of leadership. So I'm going to give you an example very much on a no names basis. So I was recently working with a really, really brilliant charity on an AI roadmap. They weren't huge, but leadership were on board with AI. But when it came down to it, when you peeled back the layers of it, they didn't really have that fundamental understanding of things like being user-centered, product in particular. They didn't have those foundational digital skills. And looking back on it, a really important learning for me is that I think I mistook growth of adoption, rate of adoption, that sort of energy around let's really embrace AI. Um, and hadn't quite appreciated that energy is not the same as confidence and having that full set of skills. So I think what I might do differently next time, and I wonder whether this is something you can apply in your context as well, is maybe do a bit of subtle testing of trying to find out where leader at with digital. Now, how much experience do you have as an organization of managing product? How often do we talk about our users? How often are we gathering data about our users? Going back to basics with some of those fundamental digital principles and really just gently testing how familiar are they with what they're actually doing on it, because you can really only push them as fast as they're ready for before that chain of trust really breaks. So I think that will be important to really test how robust their understanding of digital and AI is.
Thanks, Zoe. James, do you want to jump in? There's a really interesting question there around siloed working in the organisation. You comfortable unmuting James, or I can read it out if you prefer. Okay, okay. So James has said we're in the camp where digital responsibility is distributed across the organisation, but we still struggle with siloed working. From what you're seeing, what helps organisations make that distributed approach work well?
Thank you, James. I think that's a really key point you've made there. And again, I'm still seeing a lot of this across the sector. So one thing that we always recommend in order to unlock that is to create some kind of collective digital and AI leadership across an organization. So typical example for us would be we've gone in, we've helped an organization develop a digital and AI strategy. Then as part of that, we'd say, right, you need some really good governance around this. So if you can't afford a chief digital officer, which most organizations can't, bring together a key group of people, and this might be your SLT with maybe the IT manager or whoever involved as well, And then collectively, you need to just make sure that the strategy is being executed, troubleshooting anything, reporting back up to the board. Because I think if you start to get that collective leadership going on at a senior level, then that starts to break down some of those silos. I think some of those interventions around skill sharing can also work really well in breaking up the silos at those other levels in the organization. So you could try that too. But I think cracking this thing of the collective leadership, the top of the organization, that for me is the thing that always starts to unlock those silos.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think just to kind of come on the back of that as well, the leadership program that Maddie and I run, one of the biggest benefits of that is leaders learn from each other and challenging each other and actually, looking out with the organization sometimes to what works well elsewhere, what people have done, the mistakes that people have made, and tapping into those networks that you've all got. And there's lots of people in this room that you can learn from as well. Maddie, anything you want to come in on that point
I
or
was just
leadership
going
in
to come
general?
in on that last point about what Zoe was talking about around that collective leadership, because one of the things that I've certainly struggled with within our own organisation is there's all that knowledge is there, all that understanding, all the skills, we've got all of that, but trying to get those who are higher up to understand that they don't necessarily have the time or the capacity to take that forward, and either saying to them, you need to take this more seriously by dropping something to allow you to do this, or you give it to somebody else who has got the time and the capacity to do it. And it's not through any kind of negativity from them. They feel it's their job, they feel it's their responsibility, they want to drive this forward, but they just don't have the time. And actually trying to wrestle that off them has been quite a challenge at times, which I think is quite interesting for people. So that's a
Yeah.
kind of another. I don't. That's probably more of a statement, Zoe, as opposed to a question. I do apologise, but that idea around how to convincing them that it's okay, that they don't need to do that. They just need to be aware of it and to help drive it forward. Is that maybe comment on that, Zoe, if you will, please?
Yeah, I think that's right. Because I think people sometimes feel guilty that they don't have time to lead this stuff in the way that they would like to. Um, but then if too much of the burden falls on, say, one person or in one area of the organization, you're never going to get the full benefits, the full value of digital and AI right across the organization. So I wonder whether a good way to frame it is about the benefit and the risk to the organization, because sometimes I've seen this stuff get a bit bogged down in personalities and people.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm going to finish up. There's quite a really good question from Tracy, actually. I think it's a really nice one to finish up on. Tiny charity, less than 5 staff. Previous staff have not kept pace with change. Doesn't know where to start, feeling overwhelmed. Any suggestions on that, Zoe, of where to start when you're in that kind of situation?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, Trace. I think that's such a key thing because you really want to focus your efforts on the right thing. So, in terms of keeping pace with what's happening, I think the first thing to do is to understand where you are now. So, I would use your size as an advantage because with 5 people, that's brilliant. You could find out where your charity is by lunchtime, right? You probably just need to get everyone together in the office kitchen or on a Teams channel or whatever. And maybe just do a bit of an informal dip test to find out how people are using digital and AI and what's worked and what hasn't. And then once you've got that baseline and also maybe looked at how other small charities who are similar to you using digital and AI, then you can start to prioritize what you focus on in a way that really lines up with your goals, what you want to achieve over the next year. So I'd start with that, find out where you are, what's working, what's not working, and then come together to really prioritize what do we need to focus on now that's going to help us move forward together.
Yeah, that's a yeah, brilliant. Yeah, and it'd be interesting also to explore in the team what has stopped people keeping pace of changes, what scared them, and what needs to change to get them more on board in the future. Mary, you've done lots of work with small charities on this to try and build that culture change. Any thoughts from you on Tracy's point there?
I think it's something that Zoe's mentioned a few times is around the user research. So taking that service design approach to taking that, understanding what's your purpose as an organization, what is it that the people that you're there to serve need and want, and using that as your evidence for all the other things that you're trying to do. So using that to push, if we do it this way, then that means we can serve people more. If we bring in this, then that means that frees up our capacity to be able to serve our audience more. And I think that's something for me, Zoe, that you said all the way through is use your user research. So getting out there and talking to people, what is it they need, and use that as your to push your argument, I suppose, would be my key thing.
Brilliant, thanks, Maddie. So anything that you'd like to finish on? Anything that feels for you the big message that the sector should be taking away, or the things that we need to be focusing on going forward?
I think the big message is that we really need funders to come on this journey as well. And what we said in our comms around the launch is that we know the sector can do this. We know that funders and support organisations can come together and provide funding and support, because we saw this at the start of lockdown. And if anything, I'd say the shift that charities had to make then in the long term, we'll look back on that and realise that was in comparison to what we need to do over the next 5, 10 years, that was probably a much smaller change in many ways, even though it didn't feel like it at the time. So I think if we all keep banging the drum at funders and for funders, and reminding them that they need to get behind this, because really it's about a willingness to back the change that the sector really needs. That for me is as important as the resourcing that charities should have.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, thank you. And I love that point that it's not just about money, it's about leading by example. And like, what does change look like? It cannot just come from the sector itself. It needs to come from membership bodies, funders, and sometimes government, local and national as well. Thank you so much, Zoe. That was amazing. We've shared the link to the Charity Digital Skills Report 2026 in the chat. If you Google it, it's the first thing you're gonna find as well. It's really useful. I've found it really useful in terms of shaping those conversations internally. So whether it's about bringing staff on that journey, helping your board understand some of the kind of common challenges and what they need to do differently, but do think about it as a tool that you can use in your organisation as well. So we're going to be back for Digishift 96 in October. Maybe Maddie will know the date off the top of her head and be able to pop it in the chat box. So we've got Steve McLaughlin, who's the author of Data-Driven Nonprofits. Steve is very kindly joining us from the States despite the big time difference. So that's going to be a really interesting Digishift that we've got coming up next. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks again to Zoe. That was excellent. That was really good.
Thank you very much, and apologies again, everybody, for my admin fail.
It's okay.
Well done for making it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Love to see you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks, folks.